What evidence is there that ancient scribes added material to the end of scrolls that ended up being included in the Bible? In previous lessons, we've seen how many alterations to biblical books takes the form of additions and rarely removal of material. In a later series, we'll consider important internal evidences in the books of the Bible that show that they underwent editing, but here we look at one very particular and common method for adding to the text of the Bible. As you might imagine, one of the most convenient ways to add to any scroll in the ancient world was simply to write more at the end where there was space, what David Carr calls, quote, revision by extension, close quote. But before we go further, I just want to note that I'm not attacking the belief in divine inspiration of the Bible. Many believers have come to the same conclusion that many books of the Bible are in fact composite, and simply concluded that God had an inspired prophet do the editing. You can be the judge of that for yourself. Some books of the Bible are obvious and accepted composite works, such as Psalms, and even the longer histories of Samuel through Chronicles. But several books of the Bible, which moderns don't typically think of as composite works, exhibit obvious additions to them after they come to a perfectly sensible conclusion. The sheer number of such additions is interesting. Some of them are a little uncertain, but others are quite blatant. Proverbs is a particularly interesting case of a book that shows ample evidence that it was added to. The very beginning of the book claims that it is the work of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, which is still widely believed to be the author of all of Proverbs. But if you look at the beginning of the last chapter, you see that it is attributed to King Lemuel, which may have been a title since we know of no such king by that name in Israel. The name means devoted to God. Back up one more chapter and you see that it is ascribed to Agur, son of Jakeh. Back up all the way to chapter 25 and you see that it too begins another section, this time ascribed to Solomon but copied by Hezekiah's scribes. In this section you can find repeated proverbs from the first section of the book. However, I would suggest going back one more chapter to finally find the beginning of evidence of material that was added in the book. In 24:23, there is perhaps one of the earliest signs of a seam in the material, which simply states, "These also are sayings of the wise." The last chapter of Jeremiah is likewise an obvious addition, coming straight from 1 Kings chapters 24 and 25. The chapter before, Jeremiah 51, was a perfectly sensible conclusion to the end of the oracles against the nations, and actually concludes with the quite explicit statement, "Thus far are the words of Jeremiah." There are also major seams in Isaiah that suggest that massive amounts of material were added to it, not just a final chapter. These are so extensive that an entire series could be done on it, so I won't go into that here. Judges ends its narrative of the judges of Israel in chapter 16. However, there are two additional stories after this, each marked off by the expressions, "In those days there was no king in Israel." I used to think that this was the theme of the whole book, but scholars have long noted an anti-monarchical vein through the first part of the book, and are looking forward to the monarch in the latter portion. This tension continues in Samuel, but the transition point to the careful reader appears to be here between chapters 16 and 18 of Judges. After the largely chronological narrative of 2 Samuel, the story ends with the account of the rebellion of Sheba in chapter 20. Following this are some poetry and lists, along with some accounts that appear to have happened earlier in David's career, until the last chapter, 24, seems to bring us back to events that 1 Chronicles agrees seem to have occurred near the end of David's life, except that chapter 23, oddly enough, already recorded his last words. Daniel is a particularly interesting case of a book with a major scene. It is split into two very different sections. The first 6 chapters are in the third person, and are stories about the experiences of Daniel, with a couple of stories also including his 3 friends. It is written mostly in Aramaic. The second half of Daniel, chapters 7 through 12, is written in mostly Hebrew and first person, with details regarding his various visions. The two sections are nearly as different as you can imagine, except that they have a similar overall theme. God is sovereign. Except the first half of Daniel views God's reign mostly as present. Even though his people are in exile, he is still pulling the strings of the emperors that rule over them. The second half of the book, on the other hand, though it still sees God as in control, speaks of cosmic forces that are in play, currently fighting battles on God's behalf. Maybe even more amazing is the apocalyptic view of the second half, which foresees a day when God's earthly kingdom will finally overwhelm and rule over all the nations, but not yet. There are two other interesting observations we can make about this break in the middle of Daniel. Firstly, it has been observed that Daniel seems to have a double chiastic structure, with one chiasm in the first half, followed by a second, and those two chiasms seem to parallel each other as well, in some ways. However, the first chiasm bleeds into the second half, into Daniel 7. Similarly, the Aramaic portion of Daniel actually runs from chapter 2, verse 4, to chapter 7, verse 28. In other words, each section's introduction, sort of, is the main language of the other section, sort of a linguistic yin and yang, if you will. Perhaps more of a concern to some fundamentalists, even the Torah shows similar signs of revision by extension. Numbers comes to a sensible conclusion of its narrative in chapter 32, with the settlement of Reuben and Gad in Gilead. It might be argued that chapter 33 was part of the original book, as it covers all the places they camped in their entire wilderness wanderings, although it is definitely a transition in the text. If so, it ends with a fairly logical conclusion, a warning for the children of Israel to be sure they drive out all the inhabitants of the land when they cross over the Jordan. Chapter 34 sees another shift in the text, but this time we are receiving instructions regarding how they are to divide the land, which is logical enough. However, the next few chapters become more and more tangential to the theme of the whole book, and more in line with material that would be found in Deuteronomy. Chapter 35 covers the rules concerning the allotment of cities to the Levites and the appointment of Levitical cities of refuge and their purpose. Again, this is still connected to the topics of the book, but more miscellaneous. Finally, chapter 36 appears to be the most miscellaneous rules of all, repeating the rules concerning female heirs. The apparent end of Leviticus seems more certain as an addition. The book comes to a perfectly sensible conclusion in chapter 26, and ends with what appears to be the concluding statement that the preceding laws were revealed to Moses at Sinai. However, chapter 27 then purports to be a speech of Moses outlining laws concerning vows. In order to give them the same legitimacy as the laws that came before the previous and obvious conclusion, the author is forced to repeat the conclusion of chapter 26 in 27:34. Join me in the next series as we dive into more evidence for the composite nature of many biblical books, where we'll see that even the laws of Moses were added to and altered within the Torah itself.